Welcome to Horses for Future. This is part 2 of our conversation with Jane Myers, the developer of the Equicentral system. For thousands of years, horses have been intimately woven into our history. Riding on their backs, we have spread out over the planet. We have ridden them to war. We have used them to pull plows. Now it turns out they can help us to a healthier future for the planet. Horse people can make a difference. Through these podcasts, we're going to learn together how. My name is Alexandra Kurland. I'm the author of The Click That Teaches, a step-by-step guide in pictures, and other books and DVDs on clicker training. And I'm joined by author, veterinarian, sustainable economist, shamanic teacher, and climate crisis activist, Manda Scott. Last week, we ended the podcast with a question for Jane about how we provide adequate exercise for our horses when we're using her system. And that's where we'll pick up again in this week's podcast.
How do you overcome the issues of exercise? Because of the cattle systems, the mob-grazed cattle systems that I've seen, they are keeping animals on really quite small areas and then moving them on based on the dry matter of the grass quite quickly. And obviously we want our horses, so you've got your 5 horses on 2 acres. If they were cattle, you'd divide those 2 acres into very small areas and you'd move them on rapidly.
Yes, daily.
And with
usually,
horses,
yes.
you want the horses to be able to move more.
Yes. We say, we say there's a sort of happy medium. You've got to find your own happy medium. One thing that's very interesting is that the more biodiverse the pasture, the more the horses move anyway. So if you had a 10-acre paddock, but it was 100% of one plant species, the horses would, when you first turn them out in there for the very first time, the horses would go around it. They'd looking for different pasture species. When they work out that it only has one type of grass in there, so it was a monoculture, they would actually then concentrate their time on grazing as near to the gate as possible, because they're always on the lookout for you, Meals on Wheels, because you're going to bring them something different. You're going to bring them some food, some supplementary food or whatever. So they won't move much at all, even though they're in a 10-acre paddock. On the flip side, if you turn a horse out in, say, a half-acre paddock, but it's very, very biodiverse, they will constantly walk around taking a bite here and a bite there and so on. And we've actually got a client who's videoed this, and it's fascinating to see. Even though she's in an area in Sydney, and even though her paddocks are very small, they're moving constantly. And then as soon as they finish the grazing bout, they're moving back to the yard for a drink. They carry out their loafing behaviour, which is standing around, snoozing, a bit of playing and so on. They walk themselves back out to the pasture, and you would be amazed how much they actually move. So what we try and instill in people is it's not the size of the pasture, it's the biodiversity in the pasture that will dictate movement. It's nothing to do really with the size of the pasture, because horses don't, what they do is as they're grazing, they're just taking a step, taking a bite, and another step and a bite, and so on. And that is what creates the movement, that biodiverse pasture, not the size of the pasture. Does that make sense?
Sure does. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Now that's a fascinating thought, because it's not what you would logically think. You would think, if I want my horses to move, I need to give them more space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ideally, it's ideal to have slightly bigger pastures. But on the other hand, a pasture can be too big, because in terms of creating more biodiversity, because if a paddock is very large, then they will tend to not graze it as efficiently. And this is where we don't want the situation of, say, mob grazing, where we move them on every day. Although saying that, in some cases, even that, and I know I'm not necessarily on about creating little squares, but strip grazing is a form of mob grazing. You're moving them across the pasture by moving the fence every day. But what we advocate is, instead of grazing it really short, then moving the fence, you get them to graze it down to that 5 centimetres and then move the fence. And it's better if you can do what we call block grazing, where you follow them up with another fence. If the paddock allows that, you follow them up with another fence. so that they're not going back over the area they've already grazed. But it all depends on the layout of your paddocks. But as I said, it's once they've done their initial bombing around that they do when you tend to turn them out. And as I say, you don't even tend to get that much with the equicentral system because you're not confining them, or if you are fastening them up overnight, for example, which some people do overnight or through the day, you might get 5 minutes of running around when you first turn them out. But once they get the heads down and graze, they're just step, graze, and so on, step, munch and so on. They're just doing that as they move around the pasture. They're not galloping around all of the time. They're only doing bouts of that, and it's usually only when you first turn them out.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you.
So where I am, in the summer we have horrific flies, the biting flies. So the horses don't want to be out during a good chunk of the day.
No.
And there is always the worry of overgrazing and the issues you get into with laminitis. So I don't let my horses graze 24/7.
No, that's good.
So can you speak to that?
Yes.
So in terms of my setup, the pasture gates are opened around 4 a.m. and the horses are in by 10.
Yes, that's good.
The advantages to that versus the pasture gates are always open. Where do we come down in that?
Yeah. Well, what we say is if horses have already had laminitis or they're likely to get laminitis, then yes, absolutely, you need to be very careful that they're not getting too much grass. And so the way you're doing it, that's fine, that's perfect. Where you're letting them out very early in the morning, and then bringing them in, mid-morning, that's just great. And if the horses, even if they only get one grazing bout a day, because that would be what we'd call one grazing bout, if they only get one grazing bout a day and then the rest of the time is on hay, then that's fine as well. And what we advocate as well is that, just say you've got a horse that you are transitioning over to eating more hay and grass from a previously restricted diet where you were weighing everything and so on. So now you're changing him over to a more ad lib diet. Another way of thinking of it for those problematic horses is that you could turn the whole thing on its head, whereby the horse actually grazes in the winter on longer standing hay or foggage, and they lock them up more in the summer. And all that means is instead of locking up in the winter and letting them out in summer when the grasses are more dangerous, if you like, you're now doing it the other way around, which is actually, when you think about it, it's a really good idea, because in the winter you have less time because the weather's bad and it's dark earlier and all that sort of thing. So it's actually great if the horses can spend more time out in the winter. And in summer, you're more likely to have more time to actually exercise that pony or horse, because the weather's better and you've got longer nights and so on. So, once we explain that to people, often it's like, oh, it's a light bulb moment for them, because they've always just thought in terms of, we lock them up in winter because it's wet and muddy and cold and dark, and we turn them out in summer. But you don't have to do it that way around. You can do it the other way around. And because you're turning the horses out in the winter, as long as the paddocks are not too wet, because you're turning them out onto longer grasses, those longer grasses are protecting the soil. And yes, they're getting trampled a little bit, but that's good for the soil anyway. They're putting all that organic matter back into the soil, and it means that those horses can go out in the winter, which is fantastic. And if you're doing foggage, which basically is just growing your grass up and letting them graze it like standing hay, you're saving on all that money spent on making hay and storing hay and feeding it all out in the winter and so on. And you probably end up with a mix of both. You still probably have some baled hay as well. But letting them graze that standing hay in the winter can be so liberating in terms of how much time it saves you, and not having to lock them up in winter, but instead control their intake a little bit more of fresh grasses in the summer more, or more likely the spring and the autumn. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and it's, again, so the opposite of what we often think. And in the summer, you can barely push the horses out the door. They don't want to go out.
Yes,
the
that's
flies
right,
are
because of
horrible.
the insects. Yeah, that's it. And in winter you don't have that.
Yeah, that's right. They'd much rather be out.
Absolutely.
And even pawing through the snow, that's an enrichment for them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And when the ground's frozen, they're not doing any harm anyway. Yes.
Interesting. All right. Now, does it make a difference what in your recommendations if you're on clay soil? So I've always been on clay, and I'm familiar with it. I know I know how to deal with clay because that's, as a gardener, as a horse owner, that's what I've had. So I don't have experience with sandy soils. Do your recommendations change at all if you're on a very...
No, well, what's really interesting is that clay and sand soils both require exactly the same, in that both of them require more organic matter.
Organic matter, yeah.
And the solution to dealing with both of them is to increase the organic matter. So once you get that happening, then they're not a problem anyway. Obviously, clay soiled in a wet time of year, then you've got to watch them more. But if you over time get that organic matter really built up in the clay, you won't even know you've got clay, particularly in the end, because there'll be so much organic matter in there. You'll have so much plant growth that the clay then is not a problem anyway.
That's right.
I mean, there's some parts, some areas, especially in the UK, down south, where the clay is horrendous. But again, you can only do what is the best compromise for you. We often talk about how horsekeeping is about compromise. It's about getting the right compromise for you that works. So we talk about these broad ideas, but you have to then take those ideas and make them work for you. And we give people lots of help with that, how they can do that. And people all around the world have been doing this now for quite a few years, and so there's the solutions to pretty much every problem in the end, but it is about compromise. So getting back to clay and sand, as I said, just say on your property, most areas of land, you'll have one area that's more clayey than the other, for instance. So you would pick your standing hay paddock for the winter as being the one that's least clayey, at least initially, until that organic matter builds up in that clayey area. So the area that you do go out to in the winter would be the driest, highest paddock usually, because that's the one that's going to take longer to get to that stage where you need to get them out of there because they're starting to damage the paddock. And one thing we often say to natural resource managers when they say to us, are you going to be teaching our clients all about different soil types and all that sort of thing, is what we actually say is horse owners, because this whole thing about soil and land management is quite new to them, all they need to understand really is that soil is either too dry or too wet. And at most times of the year, it's one or the other. Very occasionally, it falls into the just right category. But a lot of the time, it's either too dry or too wet. And some countries, like, say, Australia, it tends to be too dry, but it also definitely gets too wet. In the UK, it's too wet most of the time, but sometimes it's too dry. But basically, once you understand that, and you understand that when it's in either ends of the spectrum like that, if you just let your horses out on their willy-nilly, they're going to be causing damage to the land. That's all you really need to understand. You need to learn how to identify that and remove that grazing pressure once it gets to that stage.
Yes.
Does that make sense? And later on then they can learn about, more as they get more excited about it, because amazingly, once people start to learn a little bit, once they start down this path, they then start to get really excited about it themselves. Whereas if you go straight in there and start trying to teach people all the differences between soils and, too much information about soil initially, it can be, it's not very sexy. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Initially.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, I'm going to use my own pastures as an example, because I think one of them is very typical. It has an area in it that is very wet. In the spring, it's the last area that dries out. It's a very wet area. The grass that grows there is not grass that the horses seem to want to eat. It's where they drop their manure, and then they'll overgraze other sections of the field. And that, I think, is a very typical. I see that a lot in pastures. So
yes,
how do you deal with a pasture that has these very definite zones in it?
Yeah.
So there's a zone the horses don't want to graze in.
Yes. Well, there's a very, very simple solution for that. And that's just that You look at each pasture, and often a pasture has been fenced incorrectly to start with, meaning that on a lot of horse properties it's been fenced into these nice little square areas, and it's not taken into account the fact that one pasture's got a low-lying wet area and a high-dry area all in the same paddock. But it's very simple to remedy, because all you need to do is put an electric fence, say, across the two, or fence off the low-lying wet area or whatever, you separate it, and you graze them at different times. Or in your pasture, as you said, if you've got a circular area that's just like a low-lying wet boggy area, you put a fence around that and only graze it at the right, when it's just right to graze. So that would be when say in a long, hot, dry summer, then what's beautiful about doing that is that saves that then for when the rest of the pasture now has been grazed enough and it's not growing back quickly enough because it's too dry. You've now got this area that carries on growing grass for much longer because it's wetter, but you haven't actually grazed it yet. So you've held that back, and now you can graze it because the conditions are just right. So again, once people learn how to see that, they can then see, how to do that. So in Australia, very typically, people build what's called a dam, but basically it's a man-made pond in a paddock. And what we teach people to do over there is you put a fence around that and you separate that because you don't want the horses drinking in there anyway. You want them coming back to the holding yard to get a drink anyway. But also it means that by fencing it off, all those plants can grow around that water. They can filter the nutrients out. They can keep the water clean. And then even if it's just a few times a year, when it's very hot, for example, you can let them in there, let them give it a really quick, rapid graze, let them play in the water if you want them to, and then get them back out because you've got that area fenced off separately. You can then control that. Whereas when it's just part of the paddock, you see it all the time in Australia. These dams are just totally overgrazed. They're all boggy around the outside. Nothing grows around them. They get silted up because the land itself has been overgrazed, and then over the years they have to be redug out because they've been silted up and so on. Nothing lives in them, and then they get lots of algae on them because all the manure's getting into them. And again,
yeah, I was just going to say that
a simple fence just turns it around.
Yeah.
All you do, fence it off, let the vegetation grow, and that downward spiral of events suddenly then turns into an upward spiral of events just from using an electric fence.
I see that all the time with, we call them farm ponds.
Yes.
And they tend to be just these green, nasty messes. So by fencing them off, you're saying, and that makes sense, so that the plants then filter.
Absolutely.
So we're not going to see...
Creates land for wildlife as well.
Yes. Huh. So what a simple solution.
One simple electric fence can do all that. And then later on you can put a more permanent fence around it. But initially, just one simple electric fence will do it.
Right. And then you're not putting all the algicides and everything else that I've seen people trying to use. And I'm thinking of one farm in particular, the backflips they used to go through to get rid of the algae, none of which were good for the environment. And none of them worked.
That's right.
Huh.
That's right. And all it takes is that fence to do it. It's just fascinating how simple a lot of solutions are.
Yes.
As humans, we tend to overcomplicate things, whereas often the least expensive and most simple solution is the best. It's about getting the animals to do their thing. Let them help you and you help them at the same time. It's about learning about their behaviour and what they need, but also about wildlife. So for instance, when you were talking about the amount of insects on your property, over time, and it could take several years, but over time, you will even see less biting insects, because if you provide habitat for wildlife, so you start to get more bats and birds and so on, they will start to eat many more insects because there's more wildlife there. So you see less insects. One of the reasons we see so many insects these days is because there's not enough land for wildlife. So we're bound to see these plagues of insects. We see that again in Australia, that's very common. But even all countries have these problems because we've used insecticides so willy-nilly, and we've also cut down the hedgerows and the habitat for wildlife. And on a horse property, this is another beautiful thing. A 5-acre property can become a haven for wildlife so easily. All it needs is the corner of every paddock, which is dangerous anyway if you've got square paddocks. You put an electric fence across the corner, you plant a tree in the corner, you've created a safer corner for the horses, somewhere that they can't stand in the corner and wear it out. Instead, it becomes a home for a tree, which becomes habitat for all these species of wildlife, which pay you back by eating all the insects, eating a large amount of insects.
Yes.
So another massively simple solution, a little bit of fencing across the corner, a tree, and then you leave it to go. And in time, that's going to become part of your wildlife corridor that you're going to create, and hopefully your neighbours will do the same, and you're going to have these wildlife corridors right across the countryside. So horse owners can so much be the solution to what the problems we're having now. As farms are getting commercial farms are becoming larger and larger, if we've got these pockets of horse properties around the countryside, then they can do an enormous job of recreating land for wildlife, sequestering carbon through better grazing management. It's so exciting, it really is.
It is, and that's that horse people, that we truly can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Truly can. I saw that our swallow population this year has really ballooned. Because, we started with the one swallow nest in the first year the barn was there, and now we have so many swallows, and it's wonderful. And there are no flies in the barn.
Wow.
Because
yes.
we have those swallows.
I know, it's fabulous, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's such a obvious example and a great example of exactly what you're talking about.
That's right. I mean, the subject of dung beetles is another case in point, is that we do all these things with manure, and up to recently we've completely ignored the world's dung manure expert, which is dung beetles. There's nothing we can do with manure that comes even close to what a dung beetle can do. The dung beetles, they remove it, they aerate the soil, they take the worms too far down into the soil for them to survive. By worms, I mean parasitic worms. They take the nutrients deep down into the soil, and the roots of the plant have to go down further to reach them. It's just unbelievable the amount of jobs they do. So the humble dung beetle. So it's just fascinating how once we look at nature and see how much of that we can get working for us, then the problems just go away if we're willing to look at it. And we have so many people now doing this. We've got a fabulous Facebook group which just goes from strength to strength, and so many people are excited about what we do. We've been teaching this now for about 15 to 20 years all around the world. We've even been over to the States once teaching over there. And people are finding that it doesn't actually matter what climate you live in. It works just the same, whether you're in a semi-tropical or tropical climate, whether you're in dryland climate or whatever, because it's all about increasing organic matter, increasing land for wildlife, because that in turn then will help you too. So it's about increasing biodiversity, and then it pays off by being your horses are healthier and happier, so they have better welfare, but also you're going to eventually spend less. You'll spend less time as well. You'll have more time to actually do the things you love with your horse. So instead of spending hours picking up manure, which you don't need to because the dung beetles are doing the job, then all that time that you spend, you can instead spend with your horse and exercising your horse if needs be, or whatever you want to do. The things that you thought you were going to do when you first got into horses, but didn't in the end, because the way you're keeping them is just taking too much time and money.
Right.
You can turn all that around.
So, a couple more questions. In which order do I want to ask them? Biodiversity, really important. Are there things in addition to what you've been talking about that we can be doing, should be doing to increase the biodiversity in our pastures and in the hedgerows around the pastures?
Yeah. So various things you can do to increase biodiversity. So number one is better grazing management, which is what the exponential system is about. So straight away that will increase the biodiversity anyway. Another thing is finding out what should be growing in your area, and there's usually groups in the area that you live in that will be to do with natural resource management. So you can usually ask about what sort of plants should be growing in your area, and you can usually find seed mixes that that are just for your area. So you can hand seed that into mulch. So anywhere the horses have eaten hay, you leave it on the ground. When it starts to rain, just throw seeds into that. Obviously get the horses out of there and let that, those seeds germinate into that mulch, or even just throw them into the paddock itself, overseed into the paddock itself. So that will increase your biodiversity. Then for the hedgerows and so on, you can fence off around the outsides of your paddocks with different plant species. Again, get information about what is local to your area, what should be growing in your area, because you shouldn't be trying to grow a plant that's from thousands of miles away. So it's all about improving the soil health. So again, that's by your rotational grazing will take care of that. And then you'll get your biodiversity coming through because of that, because most soil already has thousands of viable seeds in there. It just needs a chance to get going, and that happens when you start to rotationally graze. The dung beetles aerate soil, so if they get going, then they're actually aerating the soil for you. So what I find fascinating is that most of them, in fact, if not all the machinery we have, all it does is copy what nature does. So a ripper or an aerator is just doing the job of what dung beetles would do. A mowing machine is doing what a herd of grazing animals would do, and so on. So those animals can actually help us without us needing machinery. So yeah, back to biodiversity. So it's about getting advice about what should be growing in your area. There's often schemes where you can get very inexpensive plants, so trees and bushes, sometimes for free. Certainly in Australia, you can often get trees for free from organisations such as Landcare, and help with planting them, just to get these wildlife corridors happening again. So find out what's in your area in terms of advice and free help, and that can go a long way to increasing biodiversity.
And what if you have an invasive species? I was just out in California, and they were telling me about star thistle, which just sounds like a horrible thing to have in your field when it's not native to your area. And I know in the UK that there are certain toxic plants that you definitely don't want. So how do you manage those plants that are going to be toxic for the horses or need to be out of the pasture?
Right, so there's two things to think about there. One is that certain toxic plants, once the horses have access to a biodiverse pasture, they won't actually touch the wrong plants because they have choice, but you still have to be very careful, and you need to fully understand those plants. So if they are dangerous, and if you think that there's a chance that your horses could be grazing them, you need to learn as much as you can about that plant, and then you need to get local advice. So and generally speaking, you wouldn't go to a traditional agronomist, because they're usually just going to tell you to rip up the whole paddock. Well, not always, but they'd often tell you to poison the whole pasture. Whereas again, if you can find a Landcare group in Australia, it would be. Over here in the UK, it would be Natural England. These sort of groups that have experts about the local plants and get their advice on how to get rid of that plant. Because in some cases, you don't necessarily need to get rid of it. In other cases, you definitely do, but you need that local advice on what to do with it.
And so if I'm a horse owner and I'm thinking, that sounds really good, where do I go for that advice? The kinds of groups that I would be looking for, again, are
like natural resource management. Yeah. So as I say, in Australia, that's a group called Landcare. In the US, I know you have like outreach workers from. I know there are conservation groups, because we did talks for a few of them in around the States in 2012, and they have experts on and their approach usually is to be to not poison the whole paddock and rip it up or whatever, but to actually just look at individual plants. So there's always lots of help out there. It's just finding that help, and that's where being in a good group, and that's where your new group is going to be able to help out, because people can ask these questions. Who do I speak to in my area? And as the group gets larger, it's like in our own private group, we have people from everywhere now, and when somebody asks a question like that, they just get so many answers from people who live in their area. So that's how it works. Yeah.
Exactly. Because we can't give the specific answer to,
No.
What is the right answer for me living in New York is a completely different answer to somebody living
a really good example of that is willows. Here in the UK, willows are a great tree. But in Australia, they're a very invasive weed and cause millions of dollars worth of damage. So, people need to understand that even, like the willow here is a natural plant, but in the wrong environment, it's an invasive weed, because when it's out of its own environment, it doesn't have its own controls. It doesn't have the insects that control it and so on. And so it gets out of control. And that's what's happened in Australia with many plants. So,
and that's the definition of a weed. A weed is a flower growing in the wrong place.
It's just a plant in the wrong place, absolutely.
I always laugh when I'm over in the UK at the garden centres and I see pots of goldenrod for sale. Goldenrod, which is, and I've actually even seen pots of goldenrod for sale in our local garden centres, and that's really a riot. It's like, oh my heavens.
I know, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. You just laugh at some of these things.
Absolutely.
And but then when I'm over in the UK and I see these things like rosemary that's growing as a foundation, huge bush of it, and I think, oh, that's what I have in a little tiny pot on my kitchen counter, because it's not winter hardy. And so a weed is a flower growing in the wrong place is a good definition.
It is, that's right. Another last example of that is in Australia, there's a massive weed problem with Patterson's curse, and we went on holiday to Spain, and it's a protected species. So it just happens everywhere, doesn't it? And as you travel, you see this, and it's quite amusing.
Yes. Manure piles. So what should we be doing with our manure piles?
Right. Well, first of all, hopefully you have dung beetles, and in Australia they are huge, meaning not actually huge as in like hippopotamus, but I mean is they are huge in terms of they're very important. They have a wonderful program going over there. They put millions and millions of dollars into. So dung beetles work very, very well. Here in the UK, people notice that once they start to do the right thing, so they once you start to reduce their chemical wormers, but again, you still need to use them probably, but you need to be very careful that you're only using them on the right horses at the right time when they actually need them. And when you do that, then your dung beetle population will sometimes it will start to actually explode. It really, you really start to see dung beetle activity. Once you have dung beetles working, you don't need to harrow while they're working. In fact, if you did harrow, you'd be doing them a disservice. And if you pick up the dung, you'll be doing them a disservice, because you're removing their habitat. And as I said earlier, they can deal with that manure a million times better than anything you can ever do with it. So you let them get on with what they're best at. When they're not working, because even in climates where they have a large dung beetle populations, they're usually only working at certain times of the year, unless you're really lucky and you have species working all year round. Usually there's periods when they're not working. Depending on the size of the pasture, depends on whether you either pick up the manure, which is what you might usually do anyway. So if you have a lot of horses on a small area, then you usually do need to pick up your manure. If you have less horses on a larger area, and even better, if you have other species of grazing animals, so if you have sheep or cows grazing that area as well, then instead, as you rotate those pastures, you can harrow those pastures. But because you've got other grazing animals in there, they're picking up some of those parasites and killing them out in their system, because the parasites are what's called host specific. They've evolved alongside one particular species of animal. So the reports we're getting back is that people who manage their land in the way that we advocate in the Equicentral system, they're seeing their worm counts going down and down every year, and therefore needing less chemical, therefore getting more dung beetles. So it's just another one more layer to this system of management, where once you start to do the right thing, you start to get an upward spiral of events rather than a downward spiral of events. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And then in the holding area where the horses are standing, you'll be picking that up, and then
yes, absolutely. and composting that if you can. Yes.
So composting it, and then when you're talking about that, what are you envisioning as a really good system for managing the composting of manure? And then what do you do with it once it's been composting for a while?
Well, once it's, so there's, sticking on with composting for a minute, there's two ways of doing that. So there's straight composting, but there's also vermiculture, where you're using worms to compost it for you. So that's another really exciting thing to look into.
Yes.
Is using composting worms. But either way, you end up with compost, and then that needs to go back on the land, because you should have a mantra in your head, which is that nothing organic leaves this property.
Yes.
Meaning everything stays on the land and creates more organic matter.
Yes.
So we used to talk to horse owners, for instance, in Australia, it's very common to sell your manure for $2 a bag at the front gate. And we used to say to them, do you realise it's cost you lots more than $2 to create that stuff, and you're selling it and people are buying it as a soil conditioner, and you're selling it for $2 a bag. It should be $50 a bag. And once you learn how to manage it, you certainly would never sell it again. So we had one really interesting story of one lady who was selling it, and by the time she'd been through our teaching, she bought in lots more chickens. She was using, because this is the third way you can deal with manure. In fact, there's probably even more. But one thing you can do is use chickens to help you. So you put the manure where the chickens are, they scratch through it, they eat out the parasitic worm larvae, they add their own manure to it, it composts in place, and then that can then go back on the land. And the chickens, meanwhile, are producing eggs from that manure and from any other food scraps that you feed them or whatever. So again, it's another beautiful way of dealing with it and starting to produce some food for yourself as well. So, and that's a good example, again, going back to permaculture that we talked about right at the beginning. That's how, that chickens are so important in the permaculture system. And that's just one of the fantastic things they can do, is manage your manure for you. So they actually save you a lot of work, because they are scratching through that manure and cleaning it for you in terms of eating the weed seeds and eating the parasitic worm larvae. Just a quick, really good story about a guy we once met in Australia. He was getting paid 3 times over for manure. He was being paid to remove it from a racing stable next door. So he used to get paid to take it away every day. He had thousands of chickens, so he would drop it all on his big concrete yard that had thousands of chickens on it. He was selling the eggs from those chickens, and then he was selling the composted manure from those chickens once they'd cleaned it and conditioned it for him. So he was getting paid 3 times over for the same manure. And once we used to tell this story to people, and lots of people then went off and created that similar system for themselves, and had great results with it. So again, if you were building a property from scratch, you could actually build something that chickens could actually be part of that system for and work for you.
Interesting. Huh. So Amanda, do you have more questions? I feel as though I've been monopolizing the questions.
No, I think actually you asked all of the questions I was going to ask. Did we ever get back to fugage?
I know I was gonna head to the winter. So I live in a climate that gets very, very hot, humid, sort of tropical heat kind of hot summers, but then very Arctic cold winters. And we tend to close the paddocks in the winter. Yeah. Sometimes that's because we get ice storms early on, and it just seems treacherous to have the horses out. And then once we close the paddocks, there's just this idea of letting them rest over the winter. And it's a fairly typical for my area that people often close the paddocks for the winter. And then in the spring, at some point, you let the horses back on. So is this a cycle that we can change?
In most cases, there will be some climates where it could be more difficult. So for instance, if a really, really wet winter, if you let the grass grow too tall before you lock it off for the winter, if you get a lot of heavy rainfall, so say around Seattle in the US and here in the UK, if it gets very tall and then in the winter it gets very, very wet, it will tend to just knock it down, and it will sit there on the ground. That is still not a disaster in terms of that's that's still putting all that organic matter back into the soil. And even if it gets snow on it, the horses then can dig through that like they would in the wild and eat it through the snow. So that's good as well. But if you're wanting it to produce feed for you through the winter, then obviously you want it to be viable standing hay for the winter. Otherwise, you would have to buy in more hay. So if that's an issue, if there's a chance you're going to run out, then you would look at locking the paddock off when the grass is not too tall, so that it doesn't get knocked over too easily by the rain and the wind. Really, all you can do is play around with it. Maybe start with one small paddock and play around at what height works best, and just use that a bit in the winter. But keep in mind that if you're turning horses out onto a paddock with longer grasses on it, you can turn them out for far longer than you would if it was short grass, because when that grass is short, the minute it gets wet, their hooves start to do damage. Whereas with longer grass, they can trample around on that long grass, and it's actually a good thing. In fact, you can even throw seeds into that, and they can be trampling that into the grass for you. And come spring, that's another way that you can actually will increase the biodiversity, because they've trampled all those seeds in for you, and then when it starts to warm up in the spring, all those grasses will start to grow up.
Right. Excellent. And foggage? So what?
So sorry, that is foggage. So it's standing hay.
That is foggage.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just the idea of standing hay. So you're saving on baling costs. You're saving on trying to get somebody to come and bale it for you, because this is a huge issue for small horse property owners, is actually getting somebody to come and do the job for them at just the right time. So instead of getting somebody to come in and cut the hay for them, you're just locking the paddock up at a certain time of the year when it will grow to about 3/4 of its full height, depends. And then you're locking it up so that in the winter, you'll let them out when the times are right to graze over that paddock in the winter. We usually recommend that you strip graze them across that paddock, because if you turn horses out onto a large paddock of standing hay, they will tend to trample more than they eat, by walking around on it all day. But if you strip graze them across it, so in the winter, that means they can be walking from their holding yard out to the bit that they're strip grazing in the paddock and back again, and that's still 100% better than what they normally would do in the winter, which would normally be locked up all winter. So it's still much better. And as I said, even if they're trampling a lot of that hay, it's doing the paddock good anyway, because they're trampling that organic matter into the soil. And obviously, if it gets too wet, you wouldn't let them out at that point.
Right.
But that's still, going out sometimes is still better than not going out at all.
Interesting. Lots to consider in terms of how to do it better.
Yeah.
And then, so if we start to get things right and we see a healthier pasture, if we then go down into the soil and we start talking about sequestering carbon, can you talk a little bit about that and what we're actually doing in the soil?
Well, what's really interesting is that we all know that we should be planting more trees, and there's been lots of emphasis on planting more trees. But what's fascinating is that pasture is actually better at sequestering carbon than trees, and that's because pasture grows so rapidly in the right conditions. When you make it so that the conditions are right, then pasture sequesters carbon really fast. Because what the pasture is doing is it's growing rapidly, and at the same time that what you see above ground is growing, that same amount pretty much is growing below ground. So, and every time that pasture is grazed, what it does is it cuts back what you see above ground, but the root system also shrinks back. And so what it does is a lot of those roots die, but they leave that carbon in the soil. Then the plant is rested, because you now rotational grazing, it grows back up again, the roots shoot out again out into the soil, and now there's a lot more life in the soil. So each time you do it, it gets better and better. So these roots now are creating more and more carbon in the soil. So it's coming down from the plant that's above ground down into the roots, and it's staying there in the soil. So the soil now is becoming this massive factory, if you like, of carbon, which is just amazing, because this is what we need. This is what Manda was talking about so eloquently in her talk, is about how important it is to sequester carbon. And this is what is so fascinating. Grazing animals are so important for this, you know. So the grazing animals are actually getting a lot of bad press at the moment, what with people talking about cows and so on. But when you actually understand how amazing grazing is, it's just so exciting to think that, and of course, you know, of course a grazing animal is going to be good for the environment. It's a natural animal that's evolved alongside grass plants. Without grazing animals, those plants cannot do their thing. This is another very interesting point, actually, is that just say you have a paddock and it's been hammered for a while and you think, right, I'm going to give that paddock 5 years off. You wouldn't really do this, but just say you did. You said, right, it's been hammered for so many years, I'm going to give it 5 years off. And so you lock the gate, you let it go to seed, you lock the gate, and you come back 5 years later. 5 years later, there will be no more carbon in that soil than the day you locked it up. Because the plants went to seed, but that's it. They can then, until they're cut back by a grazing animal or its copy, a mower, then they don't regrow and take more carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. So grazing is so important, because think about it, in the natural system, pastures don't get locked up and animals restricted from going onto them. What happens is they get grazed, then the animals move on. The pasture gets a certain amount of time before another herd of animals comes along, usually of a different species, and they cut the plants back again, and then the plants recover again, and that's what happens in the natural cycle. So grazing is fabulous for pasture plants. It's just overgrazing that's a problem. So once horse owners understand that, then that's again where it gets so exciting, because you realise that your horses are a tool for creating, for getting more carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. They're a really, really important tool, just like all the other grazing animals are, in terms of carbon sequestration.
It is truly so exciting, because
it is.
When you think that our horses can be part of the solution.
Yes.
It's just, and that there are horses seeded everywhere. So the power of influence that we have is enormous, because there are horses everywhere. Yes. And the more we learn about this,
that's right,
the more difference we can make, both for our horses' welfare, for the welfare of other grazing animals. Because what you're saying is, it's not that cows are a problem. Yes. We keep hearing this about cows and methane. It's that cows in feedlots, yes, instead of cows out grazing and being part of this cycle. Right. That's the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. It's, cows eating the way they're meant to eat, which is grazing grass and biodiverse grass. Then yes, absolutely, it's not a problem. It doesn't make any sense for them to be a problem when they're doing what they naturally do. It's when we keep them in intensive situations that they become a problem.
Oh, it is exciting. It is, because it's something that as horse owners, it's something that we can do. We can, as we create healthier pastures, we create healthier horses.
Absolutely.
And as we create healthier pastures, we are contributing to the solution to the climate crisis.
That's right. We talk about how it's a win-win-win-win situation. Yes. It's just, and what we find very interesting is our talks that we do around, mainly in the UK and Australia and sometimes in the US, but we know that we just have to get people there. As I said earlier, it's not very sexy to be talking about pasture management. We know it's going to be hard to get them there, but once we get them there, they walk out of the door at the end of the day so excited, because they suddenly realise that they've got solutions, and that they can turn their horse property around. They can make their horses healthier and happier. They can save themselves time and energy and money. Usually there's so many, it works in so many ways. It's just quite mind-boggling, really, and very exciting.
It's great. So I thank you immensely for sharing and taking the time today. So before you leave, contact information. Where can people learn more?
Okay, right. Well, we have we think it's good, a good website. So that's equiculture.net. So it's very simple. And on there are links to all our social media pages. We've also got a very active YouTube channel. That's Equiculture and Horse Riders Mechanic, because I'm also a rider biomechanics teacher. So that's the channel on there. But again, there's a link to that on the website. We have our books, which you can get on the website. And as I said, our Facebook pages are all linked off the website as well. So the easiest thing probably is to just go straight to the website, because it's all leads out from there anyway. So that's equiculture.net.
Okay.
Yeah, that's straightforward to remember, I think.
Yes.
And we like I said, we have a private group, which people who we have a course that's not very expensive, but we have a course, and then people get into the private group, and that's just fabulous group, absolutely fabulous, and has so many people in it, ranging from total beginners right through to all sorts of specialists. It's just fascinating. And again, it's just so exciting to be in there, because it's a group of like-minded people, and this is what's so lovely about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the course, it goes into more depth and how
Yes, it's 3 quite large books. But when people do the course, we work through the books in bit by bit, and they learn it all very thoroughly. Plus, they get the addition of being in the group, so they can ask any questions they want. And again, what's really good is then they can also get that local information that they need, because there's people in there from pretty much everywhere, and so they can, when they ask a question, they usually get a very local answer as well, which is great. So yeah, I mean, again, just a typical sort of problem is here in the UK, local councils will often restrict people being able to put in hard standing, and hopefully that's going to change in the future, because with a bit of education, they're going to see that allowing a horse owner to put some hard standing in is going to lead to better pasture management, but they just need to understand that. So we've got people in there who help other people, with how to do that, how to get the right advice to get their application in and that sort of thing. But yeah, everything gets covered in the group. It's just brilliant.
Excellent. Wonderful. Oh, well, thank you immensely.
Thank you. It's been very good.
Yeah. Amanda, are there any questions left outstanding?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything. That was a very broad-ranging conversation. It was really exciting.
And then, Amanda, you have a new podcast that's about to be launched, which is going to be...
Yes, accidentalgods.life will be the website, and the podcast will be called Accidental Gods, and I will send you links that we can put up on all the various places. I hope it's going to launch 1st of November, because in our Celtic calendar, that's the beginning of the new year. But I went to Extinction Rebellion last week and spent the week sitting on the roads at Trafalgar, so it might be a little bit late.
Yes.
But that's the plan.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
It's conscious evolution,
Yes.
consciously made. I think the next evolutionary step needs to be conscious, and we need to make it conscious.
Yes, wonderful.
To people
Yes.
how to do that. So that's the plan.
Right.
Excellent. Excellent. Well,
Yes.
I thank you
wonderful.
both immensely. This is going to be
Great.
extremely helpful, I know, to lots and lots and lots of
Fantastic.
people. So we'll just keep sharing and getting information out, and horse people can make a difference.
Good.
Yes,
Surely
absolutely.
can.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and do please join us on Facebook at Horses for Future, and check out our website, sequestercarbon.com. It's becoming a great information hub. And remember, horse people can make a difference. Bye for now.